Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to continue with Chapter 18, The Cold War. Today we're going to do Part 2, East versus West. Now, as the Cold War will grow in Europe and then eventually around the world in the years after World War II, there are only two major powers in the world. We have us, the United States. We're the West. All right. I don't know if I'm pointing to the West, but I'll point this way. Then there's the Soviet Union, or the USSR, or in the Russian alphabet CCCP. They are the East. All right, the West versus the East. Okay. Now, the Soviet Union consolidated its hold on Eastern Europe. This is what we call the Eastern Bloc, the satellite nations. There were elections in these countries, and in those elections, which were very much rigged, they allowed the communist parties to come to power. They were rigged so the communist parties would win. Remember, it was the Soviet army that had liberated these countries from the Nazis. They never left, so they were there, and they ensured that the elections would go their way. Now, once the communists were in power, they created a one-party communist dictatorships in all these countries, the satellite countries. And they started Stalinization of the countries. In other words, putting in Stalin-like governments in all the Eastern Bloc satellite nations. Now, communism also grew in some Western countries too. Italy, France, 28% in the election. So they were small, not majorities, but enough to be of concern. In fact, many of these communist parties in those countries started criticizing the growing power of the United States in Europe. Now, in 1946, in Greece, after World War II, when the Nazis have been thrown out, a civil war breaks out between the communists and the nationalists. Now, before the war, of course, there was a national federal government there. They are run by a king. When the Germans came in and took over the country, of course, they were out of power. And during the time the Germans were there was a partisan, guerrilla warfare against the Nazis, mostly run by the communists, like we saw in Yugoslavia with Tito. Then when the Germans surrender and go home when the war is over, the nationalist government comes back in to take over, but the communists want to stay. So that's what causes the Civil War to break out. Now, this is the first conflict of the Civil War. We're going to see the nationalists will win it, but it's the two powers. First, we have the nationalist government, the Greek government that was there before the war. They're backed by the United States and Great Britain. Here we see some British troops in combat against the communist forces. And then there's the communist rebels. They're backed by Tito in Yugoslavia, communists in Bulgaria, and in Albania. All but except one major country. Stalin was totally opposed to the Greek uprising and refused to support it. And this will be the start of the Stalin-Tito rift. Even though they're both communist leaders, Yugoslavia never followed what Stalin wanted to do. In fact, Stalin tried to get rid of him, I think I mentioned, in 1948. So there's a big rift between the two. Now, the Greek Civil War would last 3 years. There were many atrocities. You see photographs here. And in the war, 158,000 Greeks were killed. As I mentioned earlier, in the end, the nationalists win. This is a cartoon. It's showing a Greek in traditional Greek clothing. The sign in Greek means vote for the king. This was an election, and they decided to keep their king. I believe it was King George II, the king of Greece. Now, Soviets demanded military bases in Turkey. Now, Turkey was neutral during World War II until the very end when they joined the Allies. All right. Turkey was supported by the Allies, America, Britain, France, and did not come under the control of Stalin or the communists. Here we see a map You see the Soviet Union in red. The Eastern Bloc nations, the satellite nations, are in pink. We see East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and at the very bottom, Bulgaria. Of course, the other two communist countries, Yugoslavia in light green and Albania in yellow, are separate. Now, in the very bottom, you see Greece, a lighter gray, and Turkey, a little darker gray. You can see why the Soviet Union would be really interested in controlling them, because again, they are on the border. In the end, though, they both stay with the Western powers, the United States and Great Britain, and do not join the communist powers. Now we're going to talk about the Truman Doctrine. Now, Harry Truman is the President of the United States. He became president in April of 1945 when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt died. So Truman is now the president, and because of the fear of communists spreading through the rest of Europe, they looked at the elections in Italy and France, and they saw the power of the growth of communism in those countries, and it really frightened Britain. It frightened the United States. So this is going to lead to what is called the Truman Doctrine. In 1947, Truman said that the communism must not be allowed to spread to the rest of the free world. He wants to protect Turkey and Greece and prevent them from falling into Soviet control. This they will do. And this becomes the policy of containment, all right? Communism is where it is, but we don't want it to spread to the rest of the world. It's in the Soviet Union, it's in the satellite countries. Keep it there. We don't want it to spread. So that is containment. Contain it in one place. Now, important, the Truman Doctrine would stop the spread of communism. People don't realize that, but it does work. But it is the start of what we call the Cold War. Now the Marshall Plan. We're going to talk about that and how it impacted Europe. First of all, we know that World War II devastated most of Europe. Most of the cities had been destroyed. We already mentioned 21 million people homeless, right? We see pictures here of Germany, the Brandenburg Gate, Berlin. These are more pictures of Berlin, the cathedral in Berlin. And you can see the amount of devastation, and this country is not going to be able to rebuild itself by itself. All right, so. Now, the U.S. doesn't want a repeat of the mistakes of World War I. So it created a major plan to rebuild Europe, give financial aid. We see here the European recovery idea that we're going to build up Europe. You know, the Marshall Plan was very popular in Europe, especially Germany, which had been destroyed by the Allied bombings during World War II. So the United States is going to go in there and really build up the country. Now, it was called the Marshall Plan after U.S. Secretary of State George C. Marshall. Congress is going to approve $12.6 billion in aid. 17 countries will join the plan and accept help from the United States. Of course, the Soviet Union and its satellite countries refused any aid. They don't need it. Later, Marshall will receive the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, part of the plan of the Marshall Plan is to keep communism from spreading to war-torn countries. If the Soviet Union goes in and tries to help West Germany, if we don't do anything, they could be the ones doing their own little Marshall Plan type concept, and they might get these countries to suddenly become communist and join them. We can't have that happen, so we're the ones who are going to step in and help rebuild them. But also we feel that, we need to help these countries. These poor people are suffering. And because we do this, it's going to build these countries up and create strong democracies and allies of the United States. They'll also open up markets for American goods. They can buy Coca-Cola and Ford cars. The Marshall Plan is a huge success. He even got a stamp for his efforts along with the Peace Prize. So it is a great success. Now the Berlin airlift. Now, West Germany was a major recipient of the Marshall Plan. West Berlin which is the British, US, and French zones, was right in the middle of East Germany. It's like an island in a sea of communism. Now, East Germans, because communism, isn't really great, especially if you're like someone with a good skill, like doctors or scientists, so they see kind of a brain drain, as they call it, in Eastern Germany, as a lot of East Germans will go to East Berlin and then simply cross into West Berlin and then leave the country. So we see a lot of people leaving, and the East German government would like to get West Berlin back with East Berlin under total communist control. All right. Stalin is a big fan of this. He wants control of West Berlin. He doesn't like this island of capitalism right in the middle of East Germany, in the sea of communism. So the Soviets closed all road and rail access to West Berlin through East Germany. They even shut off the electricity. So West Berlin is totally cut off. All their food, coal supplies to heat their homes, is back before we have oil, so everyone uses coal, all come on trains from West Germany through tracks that are into East to West Berlin, through East Germany into West Berlin, until Stalin shuts all the roads down, so there's no truck traffic, shuts off they close the rail lines down, trains can't go in. The idea is they're going to starve West Berlin into having to give in and join the rest of East Germany and the communist country. So no food or fuel, starve them into giving in. And it wasn't going to be easy. Berlin has 2.5 million people, West Berlin. Now, Truman needs to do something. He does not want to risk a war by using military force to open the routes, like sending tanks in, because that would destroy a response from the Soviet Union, and this could escalate into a world war. So Truman doesn't want to do that. But he also doesn't want to give West Berlin up to the Soviets. All right, so he's in an idea where he's not going to give it up, but he doesn't want to use military force to force their way in. So how do you feed the people, 2.5 million people, without those rail and roads being open? By airplane. Now the Americans and then later the British join, and they start an airlift of food and fuel being tons of coal, to West Berlin, flying them in by plane. Here we see a map showing the routes. Now up here we see, I can't remember, you can see, I'm going to point, there we go, up this way. Yeah, in red, that is East Germany. And in the middle, you see Berlin. In black, of course, is West Berlin. The yellow is the American zone. You see the flag. The blue is the French zone. And the green is the British zone. And you see the two, there's going to be 3 air routes they're going to take, 2 in and 1 out. It's a lot of planes going to be flying. Now in July of 1948, they start, and it's going to last 15 months. Not, this, you'd think maybe a couple days, a few weeks, but for 15 months, the Allies fly in supplies to Berlin. The Allied code name was Operation Vittles. I always thought that was a funny name for it. Now, the Soviets laughed at this. They thought it was a total joke, totally impossible. You can't fly. We only have these small cargo planes, World War II C-47s, that dropped the paratroopers over Normandy. This is what we use for cargo planes. We don't have these large planes like we have today. So using these C-47 cargo planes, which you're going to see photographs of, we're going to try to fly all this stuff in to keep 2.5 million people. And if it's going to go 15 months, it's going to go through the winter, which means a lot of coal to keep these people from freezing to death. So the Allies will make, in end, 200,000 flights. And they will land 13 tons of goods every day into Berlin. Here we see them unloading the planes in Berlin into trucks. You see them flying over some of the bombed out areas of Berlin. People would come and cheer for the planes as they came in. And here they are in Tempelhof Airport in Berlin, unloading the goods. You can see that these planes aren't very big, but there's lots of them, and they're coming in like every minute a new plane is landing. The German children always thought this was pretty cool. They always came to the airport to watch the stuff being unloaded. One thing, this is just a side humorous story. As you watch the children there watching the planes come in, one pilot started dropping candy to the German children. Other pilots will join in, but as the children come in and the planes fly over, they open their window up and they drop candy out the window. Children start rushing to watch the planes come in because they're all waiting for the candy to come out. Now, the pilot who started this actually made up little parachutes so the candy wouldn't break when it hits the ground. Here's a little artist rendition. Now, the pilot who started it all was Gail Halvorsen, and he became known as the Berlin Candy Bomber. This is a photograph of him. He's still alive today. The last I heard, he's still alive, but he's showing one of his handmade parachutes. So that was kind of a cool side story. Now, not everything was really happy. The Berlin airlift itself is very successful. At the height of the airlift, one plane reached West Berlin every 30 seconds. The bad part was there were accidents. 25 airplanes crashed. 39 British, 31 American airmen lost their lives. You know, the winter months, rain, snow, the planes just kept flying in. And you can see here one of the planes crashing into some homes in outside the Berlin airport. Today, they've actually built they built a memorial. There's one in West Berlin, and there's three of them in what was then West Germany. You see it has the three columns there, and they kind of represent the three air routes. And around the base of the monument, you see where the flowers are. They have the names of all the people that died during the airlift. Now I'm going to talk about NATO. Now, the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine ended any thought of the U.S. returning to its pre-war isolationism. There'll be no more ideas of like America first. We are now the world leader, and we knew it, all right? We are the leader of the free world, and there's no going back. Now, the UN, as we mentioned, was created to protect its members, but remember we mentioned the 5 security members? The Soviet Union was one of them, and they could veto anything the UN wanted to do. So the Soviet Union would constantly block anything the British and Americans wanted to do to protect themselves. So the Allies wanted a separate organization for mutual protection. So in 1949, 12 countries joined to form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. It's a military alliance. Its major members were the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, Great Britain, and France. But there was also Denmark, Iceland, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Italy, and Portugal. Spain didn't want to join. You know, they still have Francisco Franco there. They're not going to join, but Portugal does. We have the Low Countries, and a lot of these Scandinavian countries like Denmark, Iceland, and Norway join. In 1952, perennial hated countries who hate each other, Turkey and Greece join. And very important, as we'll find out later, in 1955, West Germany is allowed to join NATO. Finally, in 1982, Spain does join. Very recently, today there are 28 members, including 10 former communist countries like Poland, part of NATO. And I said recently, Albania and Croatia joined back in April of 2009. Now, all the NATO countries agree that an attack on one is an attack on all. Now, the Soviet Union was against Germany being allowed to have a military. They even threatened to make their own alliance if Germany was rearmed and joined NATO. All right, the Soviet Union, for obvious reason, has this thing about Germany having weapons and, potentially doing things. And can you blame them? So in 1955, the Soviet Union and its satellite countries create what is called the Warsaw Pact. It's a military alliance of Soviet bloc countries. All right, we see now there's a little symbol up there, And if you look here, you can see it as the countries of Romania, where it is, Hungary, there's East Germany, Poland. I'm sorry, that's Romania. That was Bulgaria, the Soviet Union, and Czechoslovakia. So these things. These are all the Eastern Bloc nations. Now you may say, why was it the Warsaw Pact and not the Moscow Pact in the Soviet Union? Because the Soviet Union tried to, pretend to the world that it was Poland's idea to do this, not the Soviet Union. But of course, everyone kind of knows there was the Soviet Union was behind this whole thing and would be running it. So we have the Warsaw Pact and its potential opponent to NATO. So for the rest of the Cold War, we have NATO on one side and the Warsaw Pact as its potential opponent. So both sides kind of kept eyeing each other in the during the Cold War. If there would ever be a war between them, these are the two blocks of countries that would be fighting each other. Now, the Warsaw Pact will disband in 1991 after the fall of communism. And as I said, 10 of the former communist countries do join NATO. Now, the threat of communism will grow and will make the West very nervous. Now, two events will really heighten the tension. And 1949 is when they occur. The first event will be the Soviet Union testing. And of course, I mentioned before, testing means exploding. How do you test a bomb, but you blow it up? They will test an atomic bomb, which of course we know as the bomb. It's an atomic bomb, an A-bomb. But now there's a fear among the West that their cities could be destroyed by the Soviet Union. This is a fear. London, Paris, Washington, D.C. The second was China. Nationalist China, which was on our side against the Japanese, becomes communist. Now, there had been a long civil war in China. It goes back to the 1920s between the nationalists and the communists. All right, they were both fighting each other. During the Japanese invasion, they put their civil war on hold, but as soon as the Japanese were left after the war was over, the nationalists and the communists started fighting each other. Now, the nationalists asked the United States for help. We don't, but I mean, it was right after World War II. We really didn't have anything. We couldn't really send troops to China to fight against the communist Chinese. I mean, as much as we wanted to help them out because they had helped, been our ally against the Japanese, Americans would not really want to see American troops 5 years after World War II being sent, or less than that, sent to China to fight. Now, the communist forces, led by Mao Zedong, or as he's known as Chairman Mao, win. There he is. Chairman Mao will rule China as a communist dictator until his death in, I think it was 1970. Sweetheart, do you know when Chairman Mao died?
Not really. No.
They never. No, I'll look it up. You want to look it up for me and let me know? All right. My wife's going to look up and see when Chairman Mao died. Now, this becomes known as the People's Republic of China, or the PRC. That's still the China we know today. The capital is Beijing, although when I was growing up, we used to call it was called Peking. But somehow along the line, they went back to its traditional.
1976.
1976. Okay. He died on the American bicentennial. Interesting. September. Okay. So the capital is Beijing. Now, the nationalist forces, these were led by Chiang Kai-shek, they retreat to the island of Formosa, that's off the coast of China, and they they continue the Republic of China, the ROC, which we really refer to today as Taiwan. The capital is Taipei. It is an independent, semi-independent country. They think of themselves being independent, but China sees them as being part of their country. Now here we see the map, and you can see how big China is. But if you look down here, let me just show you here. I shouldn't use red. Let me change to a different color. I'll go with, no, I can't use dark blue maybe. Down here, the island of Formosa, That island today is Taiwan. It is the Republic of China. They consider themselves separate from, and they are separate from the People's Republic of China. But the People's Republic of China considers Taiwan part of their country, but they're being allowed to, live on their own. But don't forget, we're still in charge. That's the attitude that Communist China has. But you can see there's a big size difference between the two. Now, the Soviet Union supported, this is one of the interesting things, the Soviet Union supported Chiang Kai-shek's forces. Stalin mistrusted Mao. He really saw Mao, Chairman Mao, as being a rival to his power in the Soviet Union, as being like, top dog among the communist leaders, all right? So Stalin and Mao, they don't really get along very well. So Stalin actually helps the nationalist forces against the communists. Now, the communists won because they made fewer military mistakes than Chiang Kai-shek and because of internal fighting and corruption within. Now, the interesting thing was the United Nations continued to recognize the ROC, Taiwan, as which had been a founding member of the United Nations and it was one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council as its China representative. Even though the majority of Chinese people living in mainland China were now under communist control, the UN still recognizes the Republic of China, and it will till 1971. Finally, in 1971, the US admitted the People's Republic of China and expelled Taiwan. They were kicked out. So Taiwan today, now you can see the flag, is the most populous country in the world that is not a member of the United Nations. That is the capital of Taiwan, Taipei, and you can see the building there is one of the, used to be the tallest or second tallest building in the world. Forget what it was called, Taipei Tower or something. But anyway, Taipei is a major country and it is a major economic power today. But it's not part of the United Nations, not part of the, how many members did we say? 193. They're not one of the 193 members of the United Nations. Did we mention that in our last section? Now, I want to talk about the Korean War. Now, the Cold War is going to turn hot in Asia. In June of 1950, North Korean troops invade South Korea. Their goal was to reunite Korea under communism, both North and South, one country. Here we see a map. We see North Korea in red, South Korea in blue. And of course, who's along North Korea's border? That's right, the People's Republic of China, who we were just talking about. So they border Korea to the north. Now, North Korea has Soviet tanks, Soviet jet fighters. Here we see the Soviet MiG-15. I took a picture of this when I was in the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. We were down there, my wife and I down there in Dulles. That is a MiG-15. They gave these to the North Koreans. They had Russian tanks, Soviet tanks. So they had a really strong military, while South Korea pretty much had nothing. So needless to say, North Korea just steamrolls over the South Koreans. They capture the city of Seoul, this capital of South Korea, and they push the South Koreans all the way down to the furthest corner. And just when they're on the verge of taking the whole country over, the United Nations votes to help South Korea. Now, you might be thinking, well, how would the Soviets allow that? Well, remember how I said that China was not allowed into the UN? That really made this so, even though, Stalin is not dead yet, but Stalin was not happy with Mao, but he'd like to see them as another, on their side when it comes to votes. And so the Russians were very upset with the UN, so they decided to boycott it. And unfortunately, they weren't there the day the vote came up to help South Korea. So that's why they couldn't veto it. So the UN will send a military force made up from 16 UN countries. Now, the US will send the most, 325,000. Britain will send 14,000. Canada, 8,000. Turkey, 5,400. 2,300 Australians, 1,500 Filipinos, 1,400 from New Zealand, 1,300 from Greece, 1,100 from France, 1,000 Colombians, 900 Belgians, and even the little country of Luxembourg will send 44 men. Now that might not seem like much, but they actually lose about a third of them, become casualties. The United States also gets the commander. Truman will pick Douglas MacArthur. Now, the UN forces under MacArthur will drive the North Koreans back. They make a great invasion at Incheon, and they start pushing the North Koreans back. MacArthur will start his Home by Christmas campaign, and they get to the northern part of North Korea. But who's in that northern border? Yes, Communist China. Fearing an invasion from the United States, Communist China jumps in and joins the war to help the North Koreans. Thanks to the work of the U.S. Marine Corps, fighting very hard around Chosin Reservoir, they really stopped the North Koreans and the Chinese from able to overrun the country completely. And that's enough to blunt the force of the Chinese, who lose 40% of their force at Chosin Reservoir in North Korea, thanks to the 1st U.S. Marine Division. So the Chinese and the North Koreans, we see here, push the UN forces back into South Korea, right on the, the border, the 49th parallel. But they pretty much stop there, and both sides settle into a stalemate. All right, neither side really getting pushed far into one end, and they start making talks that maybe we should end the war. And the talks are going to go on for 2 years, where they kind of do a little bit of fighting back and forth. So on July 27th, 1953, both sides agreed to an armistice, a ceasefire, similar to what we saw in November 11th in World War I, when both sides agreed to stop shooting, and then they worked on a peace treaty. And if they couldn't, they'd go back to fighting, but they did the Versailles Treaty. In this case, they never did come up with a peace treaty. The ceasefire is still in effect, but the war technically is in effect. It's been what, 67 years. It's been in timeout, but the war technically is still in effect. They built a DMZ, a demilitarized zone, along the 39th parallel, separating North and South Korea. Back then, it was just barbed wire tied up along a fence line. They've become a little more sophisticated today. Here we see the border. I'll show you the border here. I can draw a straight line. Okay, not bad. That's the border between North Korea and South Korea. These men here are North Korean soldiers. I think one of them is actually taking a photograph, while these men here and over here are U.S. soldiers on the South Korean side. All right, that, by the way, this building up here is the headquarters of the North Korean Army that runs the, DMZ. All right, let me get these. There we go. This is the, again, we see those same buildings, these blue buildings. Here we see the, again, the border right here, and so on. All right. The blue buildings are on both sides of the lines. They use these buildings if any sort of negotiations have to go on, prisoner transfers, anything like that. This building here in the background, this is the American Army headquarters that guards the DMZ. We saw before the North Korean. This is the United States. All right. So you can see, let me get rid of all the borders here. Okay. Now, the Cold War will continue for the next 38 years. Neither side is going to gain any advantage in the war. All right, that concludes the Cold War expands, the Cold War grows, whatever title I gave it. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you got something out of it, learned something. And I will, listen, enjoy your 3-day weekend, and I'll see you on Monday. All right, bye-bye.